Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a piece of parchment. Just imagine it, thin, wrinkled, and unrolled on a creaky wooden table somewhere in a cold stone room. A flickering candle casts long shadows across it, and on that parchment, not a treasure map, not a war plan, but the earliest lines of something far more ambitious, a medieval cathedral. You're not standing in marble halls yet, nope. You're just watching a monk with a feather quill and too much ambition draw tiny arches with trembling hands. He's not an architect in the modern sense. He's a theologian, a mystic, maybe even a guy who just really liked triangles. His eyes are heavy, not from sleep, but from trying to draw something worthy of God, without a single computer, calculator, or even a decent chair. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's oddly soothing to know we're all nodding off together, scattered across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all starts with a dream. Not the kind where you show up to school in your pajamas, though medieval folks had their share of weird visions, but a literal, God told me to build a house kind of dream. Cathedrals weren't just buildings, they were prayers in stone. So naturally, someone had to design a prayer that could stand up to wind, rain, and the occasional peasant rebellion. And that job usually fell to monks or early master masons, depending on who was available, who had clout, and who didn't die of dysentery that week. These early planners believed geometry was sacred. Seriously, circles were heavenly perfection. Squares symbolized the earth. Want a floor plan? Smash those shapes together like a holy Venn diagram. Some scholars even argue that these designs were mapped out using ratios like the golden mean, not because they read math books, but because they thought math itself was divine. God, they believed, had built the universe with perfect measurements, and the least you could do was try to copy his homework. One mainstream historical fact: most cathedrals were aligned so that the altar faced east. It wasn't random. It symbolized Christ's resurrection and the rising sun. So the next time someone tells you cathedral builders didn't know what they were doing, remind them they built 600-foot long sundials with stone blocks and no cranes. But here's the twist, and it's a juicy one. Some fringe theorists suggest that cathedral floor plans encoded secret knowledge. Like, really secret. Some say they hid messages passed down from ancient Egypt. Others go full conspiracy and link the layouts to ley lines, the Knights Templar, and buried treasure. Most historians roll their eyes, of course, but hey, it's not bedtime without a little mystery, right? Back in the workshop, the master builder would draft what they called a ground plan. It wasn't just artistic, this was a living document. Every angle, every span, every planned window had to be considered with medieval precision, which is just like modern precision, except, you guessed it, without calculators. What's wild is how often those plans changed mid-build. You'd think something sacred would be etched in stone, but no. Sometimes, decades in, they'd change the nave, move the apse, or scrap the tower. Maybe a bishop got ambitious, maybe a new donor rolled into town, or maybe the guy with the original plan died and took his secrets with him, literally. Speaking of secrets, here's a scholarly debate for you. Were these cathedrals built with the help of ancient Roman manuals? Some historians think so. Roman knowledge about concrete and arches hadn't completely vanished after the empire fell. Others argue that medieval masons figured it all out on their own, through trial, error, and probably a few collapses we don't talk about anymore. Either way, the knowledge had to be passed down somehow, through drawings, guild traditions, or whispered recipes in the corner of a tavern. Imagine watching a team of dusty workers standing around a sketch of the cathedral's western facade. No hard hats, no OSHA, just faith, timber, and the occasional guy squinting and asking, "Are we sure this isn't going to fall over?" You start to see how long this is going to take. We're talking about projects that span lifetimes, not like one guy's lifetime, several. Generations would work on a single cathedral. It was common for workers to die before they ever saw the rose window sparkle in sunlight, or heard the first mass echo beneath the vaulted ceiling. Imagine signing up for a career where the main benefit is your great-grandchildren might see the final product. Talk about delayed gratification. And still, they did it. Not because they were bored or needed to win over tourists. They did it because they believed every measurement, every cut, every curve was an offering to the divine. That belief turned rough sketches into sacred blueprints. And just like that, the dream became real. Sort of. The plan was in place, even if the stone wasn't, even if the tools weren't, even if nobody really knew how long it would take or if it would work. The important part was this: the parchment existed, the lines had been drawn, the rest was just a matter of, well, hundreds of years of back-breaking labor, countless deaths, economic crises, a few fires, maybe a war or two, and an unshakable faith that heaven was worth the headache. So as you drift a little deeper into your pillow tonight, remember this: even the grandest cathedrals, those towering marvels of art, math, and hope, started with just a few wobbly lines on parchment and a belief that stone could reach toward God. Sleepy yet? No worries, we've only just begun. The parchment's been inked, the dream's been sketched, and the cathedral to be is now a set of abstract lines whispering promises. But promises don't hold up ceilings. So after all the divine geometry and sacred scribbles, we arrive at the dirtiest, sweatiest, and least glamorous part of the whole affair: digging. Imagine this. You're standing on an open field, probably once a burial ground, a ruined Roman temple, or, if luck really ran out, a swamp. There's no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a crew of grimy laborers in scratchy wool tunics and sun-cracked leather shoes. A bell rings, shovels hit soil, and just like that, the first scoop of sacred earth is torn up, except, plot twist, the ground isn't exactly cooperating. Medieval construction sites didn't come with geotechnical surveys. You had monks and masons eyeballing the soil, muttering, "Looks firm enough," right before it turned into medieval quicksand. You probably won't survive this part either, not because of danger, but because the boredom would knock you flat. Picture months of digging trenches, lugging baskets of dirt, and shouting over the clank of iron on stone. And rain, so much rain, which means mud, which means everything becomes a slip and slide of broken ankles and questionable decisions. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Foundations were everything. A cathedral like Chartres or Amiens could weigh over 100,000 tons. That's not a typo. Without a stable foundation, often dug 10 or more feet deep, you'd end up with something more like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, minus the charm. And yet these trenches were holy spaces, literally. Before laying stone, priests would bless the ground. Sometimes they'd bury relics in it, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, even bits of sacred cloth. Think of it like spiritual rebar. You weren't just building on soil, you were anchoring into heaven. But not everything was so poetic. The people doing the digging? Oh, they weren't artists or visionaries. They were mostly peasants or day laborers. Poor folks promised food, a few coins, and the glorious reward of back pain that lasted until death. There were no wheelbarrows yet, by the way, just baskets and backs. Some fringe accounts even suggest that prisoners or enslaved people were used on particularly large projects. Though this is debated, most cathedrals were community efforts, but when time or budgets ran short, let's just say ethics got a little flexible. It's like medieval crowdsourcing, but without the cheery pitch video. Now for your scholarly debate of the night. Historians still argue over just how much of the grunt work was done by volunteer labor. Some say thousands of villagers donated time out of devotion. Others suggest they were voluntold, a nice euphemism for feudal obligation. Like when your Lord says, "Help build the cathedral or I'll raise your taxes," and suddenly your schedule clears up. The hardest part? The foundation stones, massive blocks of limestone, sandstone, or whatever was available locally. These weren't tossed into place. They had to be arranged in interlocking patterns, carefully leveled and tamped down with wooden mallets, dirt, gravel, and prayer. You had to make it perfectly flat, without lasers, without levels, just string lines, water-filled tubes, and a good eye. One wrong tilt and your entire cathedral becomes a slow-motion catastrophe waiting to happen. Like Jenga, but you lose centuries later. And here's something wild. The cornerstone, the first stone laid, was a huge deal. It was often ceremonially placed by a bishop or even a king. People would gather for the event like it was the Super Bowl of stonework, trumpets, chants, incense. Someone might faint from the holiness of it all, or just from dehydration. Either way, it was a party. After that, it was back to the grueling part. Day in, day out, you dig, haul, stack, and repeat. And then it rains, and floods the trench, and you curse in Latin, badly, because now you have to do it all again. It's important to understand just how long this part took. The digging and leveling could stretch for years. Not because they were slow, but because they had no machines. Every shovel of dirt came from a human hand. Every stone moved required ropes, pulleys, and at least one poor soul being yelled at for walking too slow. The work was dangerous, too. Collapsing trenches, sudden sinkholes, rotting rope. No hard hats, no insurance. If something fell on you, you were either buried or blessed, or both. But here's the thing, this brutal, grimy stage was sacred to the workers, not in the theological sense necessarily, but in the quiet way that hard physical labor can feel meaningful. You weren't just digging a hole, you were breaking ground on something eternal. Imagine a mason wiping sweat from his brow, staring into the trench and whispering to himself, "This is where the altar will be. It's a moment of connection between vision and reality, between heaven and mud." And even in the midst of that pain, humor found a way in. Medieval workers weren't robots. They joked, teased, and probably invented the first construction site pranks. A poorly secured ladder? Hilarious. Spelling something rude with bricks? Iconic. There's even speculation that some marginal sculptures, those naughty little figures tucked away in hidden corners, might have been the stonecutters' private jokes, immortalized in limestone while the bishop wasn't looking. So while you're picturing mud-caked boots and endless lines of men hauling rubble, don't forget to imagine the laughter too, the camaraderie, the brief pauses where someone leaned on a shovel, looked at the rising trench walls and said, "One day people will think angels built this, and it was us," and a mule named Jeffrey. Eventually, the digging slows. The lines have been traced. The trenches have been shaped. The first foundation stones are finally in place. You can't see the cathedral yet, not even close. But you can feel it, can't you, rising like a whisper from the earth. Tonight, as you drift off, let your mind sink slowly into those first deep trenches, the ones filled not just with stone, but with sweat, chants, and the muffled laughter of tired men stacking the earth into eternity. Let the dirt settle. Let the foundations firm beneath your thoughts, and dream, just for now, that you're lying right where the altar will stand. The ground is firm now. The trenches are dug. The foundation stones are kissed into place, and the cathedral's bones are ready to rise. But here's where things start to get heavy, literally. Welcome to the Stone Age of sacred architecture, where each block is a sermon, and every chip of limestone carries the weight of a prayer, and several tons. You wake up at dawn, or more realistically, you were never allowed to sleep in the first place, and you're headed to the quarry, not the glamorous site with towering spires and poetic sermons. Number this place is dusty, noisy, and smells like wet rope and crushed dreams, but it's where cathedrals are born, carved straight from the earth. Medieval builders didn't order prefab blocks from a warehouse. They had to find a quarry, sometimes miles away, and extract every single stone by hand. No power tools, just chisels, hammers, iron wedges, and the occasional existential crisis. The laborers would drill small holes into solid rock, then drive in dry wooden stakes, soaking them with water until they swelled and cracked the stone apart. It's slow, it's backbreaking, and if you're not careful, the stone splits wrong and becomes the world's heaviest paperweight. Your mainstream fact. The preferred building material was often limestone. It was soft enough to carve, but strong enough to last centuries. Some quarries were so famous that they became part of a cathedral's identity. like the Caen stone from Normandy, used all across England and even in parts of Notre Dame. That's right, you can tell where a cathedral is from by the rocks in its bones. But some scholars argue that limestone wasn't always the first choice. Granite and marble were sometimes preferred for certain elements due to strength or symbolism. Problem? Those materials were harder to quarry and shape. So in most cases, practicality won out over prestige. Now let's talk logistics. Picture a crew of oxen dragging multi-ton blocks on wooden sledges over dirt roads. Mud? Deal with it. Hills? Pray harder. Bridges? What bridges? This is where you meet the real MVPs of cathedral construction. The animals. Oxen and mules hauled stone day after day, and if one collapsed from exhaustion, well, the stone wasn't going to carry itself, and just imagine the frustration. You've spent a week carving this perfect capital for a column. The carving is clean, the angel's wings are flawless, and someone in the guild even said, "Nice work." Then, halfway to the site, the cart hits a rut, flips, and your masterpiece is now rubble. You don't get hazard pay. You just sigh, pick up your tools, and start over. Here's the fringe tidbit of the night. There are accounts, some reliable, others poetic, that suggest certain stones were chosen for their mystical properties. Builders might avoid a block that felt wrong or choose stones said to have healing vibrations. One tale even tells of a cursed cornerstone that cracked every time someone tried to lay it. Was it bad luck? Bad geology? Or just a medieval guy desperate to take a day off? But when things did go right, the result was stunning. You're not just stacking blocks. You're assembling a three-dimensional tapestry. Each stone has a role: base, pillar, arch, vault. Some are carved with grooves to hold others in place. Some are just solid support. The entire structure is a delicate balance of weight, pressure, and trust in gravity. The master mason didn't just bark orders. He was like the conductor of a slow, stony orchestra. With his plans in hand, he'd guide workers, measure distances with knotted ropes, check alignment with plumb bobs, and pray his apprentices didn't mess it up while he was looking the other way. Oh, and let's talk about mortar for a second. You're thinking, it's just the glue, right? Sure, if glue was made of lime, sand, water, and months of trial and error, mortar had to be mixed perfectly. Not too dry, not too wet, and sometimes with weird additives like blood, milk, or even eggshells. Why? Because some masons swore it made the mix stronger. Historians still debate whether this actually helped or whether it was just medieval superstition mixed with pantry desperation. You know what wasn't debated? That time was not on your side. Stone took forever to cut, shape, move, and place, and winter didn't care if you were behind schedule. Cold temperatures slowed the setting of mortar, rain made surfaces slippery, and the flu was basically everywhere all the time. Still, the stones kept rising, slowly, reverently, one after another. Row by row, the walls inched toward the sky. Watching it come together must have been like witnessing a mountain grow, not from tectonic force, but from faith and sweaty forearms. One scholarly debate you'll enjoy as you drift off. Some historians argue that medieval masons didn't fully understand the structural engineering of what they were building, that they worked more from tradition, trial and error, and spiritual intuition than from scientific principles. Others insist the opposite, that these men understood load, tension, and weight distribution better than we give them credit for. After all, their cathedrals are still standing. Your IKEA shelf? Not so much. As the structure grows, the precision becomes even more critical. Stones for arches are carved in wedges called voussoirs. Keystone at the top locks everything in place, just right or just ruinous. A fraction off and it collapses. So yeah, no pressure. And yet somehow in the midst of all this complexity, there was beauty. Stonemasons didn't just carve what was necessary. They added flourishes, hidden symbols, and tiny masterpieces in places no one might ever notice. A little rabbit peeking from a column base, a knight's face tucked into a capital. One famous example, the Green Man, a mysterious leafy face found hiding in dozens of churches across Europe. No one knows exactly why he's there. Pagan god. Seasonal symbol? Or just the mason's weird sense of humor? You're probably wondering, were these guys ever proud of their work? Absolutely. But it wasn't pride in a modern, Instagrammable sense. It was quiet, generational pride. A knowledge that their names might never be known, but their stones would sing centuries after they were gone. Now tonight, as you lie in your bed, think of the stone you'd carve. Would it be part of a wall? A hidden corner gargoyle? A piece so delicate it only lived in moonlight? Whatever it is, imagine pressing your hands into the earth, feeling the cold texture of limestone and shaping something that might outlast you by 1,000 years. Let the weight of those stones cradle you now, each block resting gently on the next, steady, intentional, sacred. The foundation is secure, the stones are ready, and somewhere off in the fog of the early morning, the church bell tolls again, echoing across a half-finished skeleton of arches and dreams. You're back on the job site now, and things are going vertical. No more digging, no more mud. This time, you're looking up. The cathedral's walls begin to rise like cliffs from the ground, layer upon careful layer of stone, guided by a master mason's rope lines, and the cautious optimism of men who've already lost at least one cartload of granite to an especially rude ditch. And here's the thing you feel in your knees, even if you're just imagining it. The higher they go, the more dangerous everything becomes. You're climbing wooden scaffolding now, and I use the term scaffolding generously. Think more like timber jungle gyms lashed together with rope and prayer. There are no harnesses, no helmets, just wobbly planks and a lot of unspoken trust in your co-workers not to sneeze while you're 60 feet in the air. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval scaffolding was usually built from timber poles fitted into sockets carved directly into the cathedral walls. These sockets, called put-log holes, are still visible on many cathedrals today. Tiny square gaps that once held up the wooden skeletons wrapped around the stone giants. But here's the fringe mystery for the night. Some researchers argue that ancient masons used a form of internal scaffolding, with hidden stairways or spiral ramps built right into the structure as it went up. Think of it like medieval IKEA, secret passages for builders only. Others say it's nonsense, just creative reuse of space. But wouldn't it be fun if cathedrals had their own hidden construction tunnels? Now back to our friends on the scaffolding. They're lugging stones upward with ropes and pulleys. The simplest tool, but also the most critical. A heavy block is tied to a hoist cranked upward using wooden wheels or counterweights, and guided into place by men shouting over each other. One wrong move and, well, let's just say some stones got a second trip down much faster than expected. Accidents happened often, a slip, a snapped rope, a moment of fatigue, and down you went. There are old records of masons blessing their tools each morning, a chisel kissed, a hammer crossed against the chest. Not superstition, just hope in the absence of modern safety nets, literally. There's even an account of a particularly unlucky apprentice who survived a fall off a wall only to be crushed moments later by a falling bucket of lime. Not exactly the legacy you're hoping to leave behind. Now, despite the danger, work pressed on, because cathedrals didn't build themselves, and they weren't all going up at once. The typical sequence started with the choir, where the monks sang, then moved to the nave, then towers and transepts. So while one crew laid flooring, another scaled the walls. And those walls? They weren't just stacked like Lego bricks. They were masterfully engineered, tapered, reinforced, and filled in sections with rubble core to reduce weight while maintaining strength. Some walls were up to 12 feet thick at the base, gradually narrowing as they rose. That's more rock than most castles had, one scholarly debate that still rattles around academic towers today. Just how much of this engineering was intentional? Did medieval builders understand the full forces at play? The thrust, the tension, the compression? Or were they simply copying what had worked before, crossing fingers and fixing mistakes as they went? The truth probably lies somewhere in between, genius through repetition, and, speaking of genius, flying buttresses. We'll go deeper in the next section, but let's tease the idea now. As the walls got taller and thinner to allow more light inside, they needed help not to fall outward under their own weight. That help came from the outside, arch-like supports that looked like wings. At this stage of construction, they were starting to take shape, like ribs wrapping around the stone heart of the church. You, meanwhile, are still clinging to scaffolding, watching as masons swing chisels like artists, shaping capitals, arches, and column drums. Each stone must align perfectly. If the curve of the arch is off, the whole wall is compromised. Imagine putting together a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle where each piece weighs 200 pounds and your workspace is a swaying plank suspended above certain doom. Fun. Even lunch is a gamble. Workers would eat wherever they were, on beams, scaffolds, or tucked inside alcoves mid-construction. Bread, cheese, and maybe ale if the supervisor wasn't paying attention. There's an actual account of a mason in Rouen who supposedly carved a little picnic table into an upper ledge of the wall. Was it real? Maybe. Or maybe it's just a story passed from one sleepy storyteller to another, just like us. Here's your comic relief for the evening. On at least one cathedral project, records show that a goat climbed the scaffolding and disrupted a week's worth of alignment work. That goat was reportedly banished from the church grounds for life, though I imagine he was rather pleased with himself. Back on the job, apprentices would run up and down the planks carrying tools, water, and instructions. Many were orphans taken in by the guilds and trained from childhood. Their days were long, their blisters deep, and their dreams full of patterns and stone dust. And yet, despite the injuries, delays, and animal intrusions, there was beauty rising. If you stood back, just far enough to avoid being flattened by a rogue pulley, you could see the cathedral beginning to breathe. Columns stretching upward, arches connecting like clasped hands, shadows dancing across newly carved faces. That moment when the wall you carved yesterday meets the wall someone else finished today, and they fit perfectly. That's what they worked for. That's what kept them climbing. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavier and your breathing slows, imagine yourself high above the ground, standing on an ancient scaffold. Below, the town hums quietly, unaware of your view. Ahead, the arch waits, half-formed, whispering for completion. And above you, only sky. Let your thoughts balance gently, like stones upon mortar. Let your worries settle into the rhythm of hammer and chisel. And rest easy, knowing that even in the most precarious places, beauty can rise. So here we are again, still clinging to scaffolding, wind nipping at your cloak, the smell of damp timber and limestone in your nostrils, and one hand gripping a half-eaten chunk of bread. And now, finally, you're starting to realize something strange. This whole place shouldn't be standing. Seriously, these walls are absurdly high. The windows are too big. The ceilings are practically floating, and you can't help but whisper the obvious. How on earth is this thing not collapsing right now? Answer, flying buttresses. Welcome to the part of the story where medieval architecture stops being just bricks and prayers and starts flirting heavily with physics. Now, despite sounding like something you'd order at a Renaissance-themed cafe, flying buttresses are among the most iconic and brilliant inventions in cathedral design. They're not just decoration, they're lifelines, delicate-looking stone arms that hug the cathedral from the outside, redistributing its weight and catching the invisible forces trying to pull it apart. Let's break it down slowly. In any vaulted stone building, gravity pushes down, but also out. Think of a balloon expanding, only in reverse. The higher and more open your cathedral, the more outward force threatens to push the walls into a medieval game of dominoes. Buttresses act like external braces, countering this outward thrust by channeling it away from the fragile walls and into massive piers planted safely in the ground. It's stone doing yoga, holding tension, staying balanced. Your mainstream fact. The earliest known flying buttresses were used in the 12th century in French cathedrals like Notre Dame de Paris. Before them, architects had to build enormously thick walls just to keep things upright. But with buttresses, you could go higher, lighter, brighter. You could have walls full of windows instead of stone. Light became a building material. But here's the fringe theory that might tickle your sleepy brain. Some believe the inspiration for flying buttresses didn't come from trial and error, but from mystical principles, sacred geometry, divine ratios, and maybe even knowledge inherited from ancient civilizations. There are those who argue softly from the corners of obscure journals that the Masons encoded celestial alignments into the curve and angle of the flying arch. Were they just being fancy? Or were they trying to echo the very architecture of heaven? Hard to say. But the symbolism of wings lifting the church skyward wasn't lost on the people of the time. And now, for your scholarly debate, did medieval architects really understand the forces they were manipulating? Or were they copying techniques passed down from earlier builders, tweaking them through centuries of trial, error, and intuition? Some say the Masons had a practical grasp of weight, thrust, and stress, even if they couldn't write the equations. Others argue that every successful cathedral was a kind of accidental miracle, balanced just so by experience and divine luck. Both sides have merit. All we know is, when they got it wrong, the building fell. Sometimes dramatically. Let's talk aesthetics for a moment. Flying buttresses didn't just work. They looked good doing it. These weren't crude stone slabs. They were elegant, arching limbs, often decorated with pinnacles, those fancy stone spires, that weren't just for show. Pinnacles added weight to the buttresses, increasing their downward force so they could better counteract the lateral thrust of the walls. Basically, medieval engineers made pretty towers because physics told them to. And you, standing up there in the breeze, watched them grow, stone by stone, extending like ribs from the church's body. They seem fragile, don't they? Like fingers holding a balloon. But get close, and you'll see they're anything but delicate. Some are thick as tree trunks, their joints so perfectly fitted that even centuries later, you couldn't wedge a butter knife between the stones. Here's a fun thought. When these buttresses were first added, people were skeptical. Some townsfolk thought the cathedral looked like a wounded animal with crutches. Others assumed it was cheating. If the building can't stand on its own, maybe it shouldn't be standing at all. That is, until the first storm hit, the buttresses held strong and everyone stopped complaining. Of course, not every attempt went well. On more than one occasion, a misaligned buttress caused walls to buckle instead of supporting them. There's a recorded case in Beauvais where the builders pushed too far. Vaults collapsed mid-construction, and the project was never fully completed. So yes, even with buttresses, gravity still had opinions. What's truly impressive is how the workers knew where and how to place these supports without blueprints like we know them today. They used full-scale drawings called tracing floors laid out in the dirt or on wooden platforms. These were enormous sketches of arches and structures drawn in chalk or charcoal, where masons could test angles and curves with string and wood. It was like a giant architectural sandbox. Except the sand was your life's work, and one wrong angle might doom 100 tons of stone. Meanwhile, on the ground, curious townspeople gather. They stare at the rising arches and buttresses like they're watching magic. Children tug at their parents' cloaks and ask if angels help lift the stones into place. And honestly, looking up from that muddy field, you might believe it too. Back on the scaffolding, you wipe your brow and peer across the span of a half-built nave. It still looks like a ruin, like a broken rib cage poking out of the earth, but the skeleton is forming. And those wings, those flying buttresses, are keeping it alive. Your co-worker, let's call him Bernard, swears he saw lightning strike one of them last week and it didn't even crack. Another worker bets a jug of wine he can scale the arch and back before sundown. Spoiler, he can't, and he gets banned from lunch break wagers for a week. Even in these dizzying heights, humor survives. Someone carves a tiny face into the base of a buttress, a smirking monk with crossed eyes. Someone else replies with a rabbit chasing a snail hidden just below the stone ledge. The cathedral grows not just with faith, but with fingerprints. Quiet personal marks left behind by men who knew they'd never sign their names to anything else in their lives. And then comes the wind. A sudden gust sweeps across the open vault, and for a moment you feel the whole structure hum. Not wobble, human, like it's alive, like the buttresses aren't resisting gravity, they're dancing with it. It's getting dark now. The light bleeds gold through the half-framed rose window. Tools are lowered, workers descend. The last echoes of hammers fade into the evening. Tonight you lie down in your thoughts again, curled in your blanket like a stone nestled in an arch. Above you, invisible forces press from all sides, but you're held, balanced, supported by wings of stone built centuries ago by hands just like yours. Let that image settle into your breathing. The quiet push and pull, the way strength can live in something that looks so fragile. The elegant physics of not falling. The walls are rising, the buttresses are locked in place, spreading their silent wings around the sacred shell of the cathedral. And now, just as everything starts to feel structurally secure, the builders do something absolutely unhinged. They start cutting holes in the walls, big ones, wide, tall, gaping spaces that threaten to undo all the careful stonework that's been stacked and balanced like a giant game of medieval Jenga. But these aren't just gaps. They're promises of light, of color, of divine storytelling poured through glass. Welcome to the part of the story where cathedrals become kaleidoscopes. You're here for the windows, but not just any windows. These are stained glass masterpieces, glorious glowing mosaics that don't just brighten a space, they preach through sunlight. They were the Netflix of the Middle Ages, minus the buffering. Want to know the story of Genesis, the Passion of Christ, the lives of saints, or the Last Judgment? Just look up. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Stained glass windows were more than art. They were theology in pictures. Most people in the Middle Ages were illiterate. Books were for monks. But glass? Glass spoke a universal language. Through color and light, it told stories the whole town could see. Scholars call it the Bible for the poor, which sounds a bit condescending, but the idea was simple. The walls preached even when the priests didn't. Now picture this. You're a glazier, one of the elite craftsmen tasked with creating these glowing sermons. You don't just wake up and throw colors together. No, you follow a process so intricate it makes sourdough baking look like cheating. You start with sand. Yes, sand, which gets melted down in a fiery furnace mixed with potash and lime until it becomes molten glass. Then the color is added. Different minerals make different hues. Cobalt for blue, gold chloride for red, manganese for purple. It's chemistry and chaos, trial and smoke. That's where the art begins. The glass is blown into large cylinders, sliced open, reheated, and flattened into sheets. These sheets are then carefully cut with a red-hot iron into the desired shapes, figures, frames, symbols, and painted with black enamel for facial features or inscriptions. Each piece is set into a lattice of lead cames, forming a mosaic that's not just decorative, but doctrinal. And here's your fringe tidbit of the night. Some believe that certain color patterns or sequences in stained glass had esoteric meanings, almost like coded messages. For instance, deep blue often symbolized the Virgin Mary, while green represented rebirth. But there are theories, though not widely accepted, that some windows aligned with celestial events or numerological schemes hinting at secret knowledge passed down through generations of glaziers. Some even claim hidden faces or geometries appear only when sunlight hits at just the right angle, like divine Easter eggs. Of course, whether that's true or just the fever dream of a particularly passionate art historian is up for debate. What's not up for debate is the cost. These windows were expensive, really expensive, like Sponsor a Pain or Your Soul Won't Rest. Expensive. Wealthy merchants, bishops, and even kings would donate money for a window and have their likeness worked discreetly into the bottom corner. You might see Peter crucified upside down at the top, and then, down below, a smug-looking noble in a red hat holding a scroll that just happens to mention his donation, fundraising through flattery, classic. And now your scholarly debate. Just how much influence did donors have over what went into the windows? Some scholars argue that glaziers and clerics chose the themes. Others insist the patrons dictated content to match their personal legacy, essentially turning God's house into a medieval billboard. One famous example is a donor who insisted on being depicted kneeling beneath an image of Judgment Day, with his face turned smugly away from the pit of hell. Subtle. Now picture the installation process. You've got a 30-foot high Gothic window frame, shaped like a pointed arch or rose blossom. You've got hundreds of pounds of fragile colored glass bound in lead, and you've got a ladder. Installing stained glass in a medieval cathedral wasn't glamorous. It was tense, delicate, and slow. Each panel had to be lifted carefully, sometimes hoisted by pulley, sometimes handed up piece by piece, then slid into place and secured with molten lead or iron bars. Break one piece, start over. Sometimes a single window took years. The famous rose windows at Chartres, each one spans nearly 13 meters in diameter and holds over 10,000 individual pieces of glass. Imagine crafting a cosmic jigsaw puzzle, only you're suspended 40 feet in the air and the pieces are made of fire-hardened crystal. And then, the moment of truth, the sun rises, it pierces through the eastern lancets, slides across the transept, and hits the windows just right. Suddenly, light isn't just light anymore. It's ruby, sapphire, emerald, and gold. It spills across the stone floor in pools of holy color. Figures come alive. Christ, Mary, saints, angels, farmers, fish, dragons, even the occasional monkey wearing a crown. The whole cathedral turns into a storybook written in radiance. Even the most cynical peasant, cold, muddy, taxed to the bone, might walk into that cathedral and forget just for a moment how hard life was. Because in that light, they were part of something bigger, something transcendent, something shimmering. Now, you should know this. Not all the windows were spiritual. Some were funny, some were strange. There are windows that depict pigs playing bagpipes, roosters preaching, a man being devoured by snails. Were they moral lessons, private jokes? Nobody's quite sure, but it proves this. Medieval cathedrals weren't just monuments to God. They were mirrors of humanity, silly, messy, strange, and deeply beautiful. And even when war came, when fire tore through the roof or armies looted the nave, locals would risk everything to save the glass. They'd take it down, hide it in barns, bury it beneath fields. Because they understood. This wasn't just decoration, it was memory. It was scripture. It was survival. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine yourself sitting quietly beneath one of those windows. Morning has just begun. The dust of the worksite floats like gold in the air. The light shifts slowly across your face, warm and red like embers. And in that shifting light, stories unfold, not spoken, not written, but glowing. Let yourself drift through those images. Joseph's dream, Moses parting seas, angels blowing trumpets, Mary with her soft, sad smile. The world outside fades. The glass holds everything now. And through it all, the sunlight moves, like grace across your skin. So you've seen the walls rise, the buttresses fly, and the windows explode in heavenly color. You're probably thinking, well, surely we're done now. Just pop a roof on this holy beast and call it a day. Not quite, because now comes the part that breaks backs, brains, and, if you're not careful, entire buildings. We're going up. We're going inward. We're going to the ceiling. Welcome to the world of vaults. Not the kind with gold and treasure, unfortunately. These are stone vaults, the majestic, sweeping ceilings that turn the inside of a cathedral into a cave of geometry. If the windows are the eyes of the building, the vault is the crown, arched, intricate, and absolutely vital. Now, vaulting isn't just about looking pretty, it's the structural backbone of the ceiling. Instead of a flat roof, which is, let's be honest, a little boring, medieval architects built intersecting arches, called ribs, that carried the weight down into the columns and piers below. The spaces between those ribs were then filled with lighter stone or a mortar to complete the vault. Your mainstream historical fact: the ribbed vault was a revolutionary innovation of Gothic architecture, It allowed builders to cover larger spaces with less material and more flexibility. Unlike earlier barrel vaults, which were basically stone tunnels, ribbed vaults could stretch across complex layouts, create height, and distribute weight like a mathematical dream. But here's where things get sneaky. You know all that stone overhead? The heavy ribs, the curved panels, the soaring ceilings that make people gasp when they walk inside? They're supported by wood. Yep, wood. Specifically, hidden timber frameworks that held the stone in place while the mortar dried. These temporary wooden structures were called centering, giant scaffolds that supported the arches until they could stand on their own. You'd never know they were there, unless you were part of the crew or happened to be a bat, living in the rafters. This brings us to your fringe fact. Some historians and masons believe that certain sacred geometries were embedded in these temporary structures, not just to guide construction, but to align with cosmic patterns or religious symbolism. There's speculation that the layout of vault ribs mirrored constellations or biblical numerology. Did they build ceilings based on star maps? It's debated, but it wouldn't be the strangest thing medieval builders did. Now, speaking of debates, here's one for your scholarly dreams. Who actually designed the vaults? Was it the master mason, guided by his measuring cords and chalk lines? Or were these designs passed down like spells, learned through apprenticeship, guarded by craft guilds, never written down? Some researchers believe vaulting techniques were closely guarded secrets, shared only through oral tradition and hands-on practice. Others say they were written in codes, hidden in carvings, or sketched on tracing floors now long forgotten. Either way, the process was precise. The ribs had to curve just right. Too steep and they'd buckle. Too shallow and they wouldn't hold weight. And here's the kicker. The stones of the rib weren't rectangular. They were voussoir, wedge-shaped, each one custom carved to fit its exact place in the arch. Miss by a few degrees and you've got a disaster in slow motion. Now imagine building this without being able to see the final product until it was done, until the last keystone was tapped into place and the wooden centering was carefully removed. The moment of truth. You can almost hear it. The groan of timber as it's lowered. The sharp inhale of every worker on the floor. Will it hold? Will the ribs distribute the weight into the piers like they're supposed to? Or will tons of stone come crashing down and crush 3 months of work and a dozen unlucky apprentices? Most of the time, it held. And when it did, the workers cheered. Vaults were magic. Vaults were triumph. They meant the roof could be sealed, the rain kept out, and the echoes of choirs begin. But not all vaults were created equal. In some cathedrals, you'll find sexpartite vaults, 6-part divisions with extra ribs. Others feature tiercerin vaults, filled with decorative ribs that don't bear any structural load at all, just making things look fancier. Then there are fan vaults like the ones in England, which look like a stone peacock exploded overhead. Seriously, look them up. They're ridiculous. And while the stonework gets all the glory, it's the woodwork above it, out of sight, out of mind, that often held the whole thing together. In fact, many cathedrals still contain vast wooden attics above their vaults. These were often made from enormous oak beams, some of which came from trees already centuries old when they were cut. Here's a fun little secret. Some of these wooden frameworks were so complex and beautifully built that they're considered cathedrals in their own right. Historians call them the forest, a nod to the countless trees sacrificed for the sake of glory. Some say the forests were so vast that bats, birds, and even monks used to sneak up there to hide, nap, or pray. Want another curveball? In some rare cases, the wooden beams were intentionally left accessible because they were also used for maintenance. That's right, secret staircases, crawl spaces, passages through the spine of the cathedral itself. Like veins in a sleeping giant, cathedrals were not just sacred, they were functional and kind of spooky. You know who spent a lot of time in those beams? Rats. But also bell ringers, roof walkers, and sometimes rebellious monks who needed a quiet place to sulk. It's rumored that at least one medieval manuscript was written in the rafters, hidden from the abbot until the writer finished sulking. Monastic drama at its finest. Back down below, the townsfolk are starting to notice. With the vaults completed, the interior now feels infinite. You step inside and the ceiling rises above you like the sky. Light filters through colored windows and spills across the stone ribs like rivers of fire. The air echoes in strange ways, bending sound into something holy. Even the birds flying through the open, clear story windows seem impressed. Vaults changed everything. They were the architectural exclamation point that declared, "We have reached toward God," and we didn't fall over. And through it all, humor clung to the stone like moss. Masons would carve their initials into hidden ribs. One group is said to have sculpted a small man with his pants down, hiding in the upper vaults, eternally mooning the altar. Another left a carved snail beside a lion, as if to say, not everything here has to be serious. So tonight, as you nestle into your blanket and feel the ceiling of your own room pressing softly overhead, think of those vaults. Think of the men who built sky into stone. Think of the hidden beams, the forgotten secrets, the sacred ribs holding up the dreams of an entire age. Let yourself rest beneath them now. Let your thoughts curve upward like arches, light as oak and strong as limestone. Let sleep carry you, vaulted, supported, safe. You've seen the walls climb. You've stood beneath ribs of stone. You've watched sunlight dance through sermons painted in glass. But now, as the cathedral begins to look less like a construction site and more like a piece of heaven, something curious happens. The building grows a face, eyes, mouths, twisted grins, saints with solemn stares, angels with flowing robes, and just above them, monsters, creatures with claws, wings, and teeth so sharp they look like they were carved by someone working through some personal issues. You're entering the world of cathedral sculpture, and trust me, it's weird, wonderful, and occasionally unhinged. Let's start with the basics. Sculpture in medieval cathedrals was not optional. It wasn't just decoration, it was theology, education, storytelling, and civic pride, all chiseled into stone. And unlike the stained glass, which lived inside, sculpture often adorned the outside of the building. That means rain, wind, birds, and time would all chew away at these masterpieces, which only made the sculptors work harder. Your mainstream historical fact, sculptors carved thousands, literally thousands of figures into cathedrals. Saints, prophets, kings, martyrs, biblical scenes, and Christ in majesty. These weren't just artistic choices, they were spiritual road signs. The west facade, the front face of the cathedral, often depicted the Last Judgment. The message was clear, walk in humility, or you might end up where the demons are pointing. But here's where it gets fun. Tucked between the holy figures were things that, well, weren't so holy. Monkeys wearing crowns, naked men wrestling serpents, knights being chased by ducks. It's as if the sculptors were balancing sermons with sitcoms. This brings us to your fringe tidbit. Many scholars believe these grotesque or bizarre carvings weren't just jokes. They were lessons in disguise. Some represent sins, others were meant to scare away evil spirits. But a growing number of historians argue that some of these figures were the sculptor's way of rebelling, subtly mocking the clergy, poking fun at church politics, or just venting stress by carving a pig-faced abbot. And honestly, respect. Now let's talk gargoyles. Ah yes, the creepy stone creatures clinging to rooftops, mouths agape, wings half-folded, tongues lolling. They look like they belong in a Tim Burton movie, but they served a very practical purpose. Your scholarly fact of the night. Gargoyles are waterspouts. That's it. Their open mouths? Rainwater drains through them. Their grotesque shapes, designed to fling water far away from the walls to prevent erosion. The name gargoyle comes from the French word gargouille, meaning throat or gurgle. Basically, they're glorified gutters, and yet, there's so much more. Each one is unique. Some are terrifying, others are goofy. One cathedral has a gargoyle picking its nose. Another features a winged dog howling at the moon. There's even a famous one shaped like a man covering his ears, as if he's already tired of the bells that haven't even been installed yet. Why were the sculptors given so much freedom? Here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Some believe that sculptors had relative autonomy over decorative figures, especially the ones high up where few people could see them clearly. Others argue that everything was overseen by the church, and what looks like rebellion was actually sanctioned symbolism. The truth is probably both. Official approval below, stone mischief above. And while we're here, let's remember, carving these figures wasn't easy. You didn't just grab a hammer and go to town. You worked with chisels, mallets, and rasps, using soft limestone or sandstone, whatever was locally available. You'd rough out the shape, then add details, hair curls, teeth, folds, and robes. It was slow, delicate, dusty work, and often done high on scaffolding in cramped spaces with poor lighting. But these men, the imagiers as they were sometimes called, were artists, not anonymous laborers, but revered craftsmen. Some had styles so distinct that modern historians can identify their work across different cathedrals. One, known as the Master of the Smiling Angel, carved radiant, almost cheeky figures full of warmth and humanity. Another favored long haunted faces as if every saint knew something you didn't. And it wasn't just saints. Every level of society was carved into these buildings. Kings and peasants, bakers and soldiers, women spinning wool, children stealing apples. The cathedral wasn't just heaven's monument. It was a carved snapshot of the medieval world. One particularly famous carving shows a man being eaten by a lion while casually stabbing it from the inside. Scholars argue about the meaning, justice, revenge, dinner gone wrong. But it proves the point. Sculpture was dramatic, emotional, even cinematic. Let's not forget the capitals, those carved tops of columns inside the cathedral. These were prime real estate for storytelling. Some showed biblical tales, others moral allegories. Still others, full-on chaos. There's a capital in autumn that shows a demon weighing a soul, while another demon cheats by pushing down the scale with his finger. Eternal damnation, but make it slapstick. There's even a legend of a sculptor who carved his own face into a hidden corner of the cathedral, complete with a wink. Was it hubris? A final joke? Or just his way of saying, I was here? As you walk through the nearly finished cathedral now, every surface seems alive. The stone isn't smooth and blank, it's rippling with humanity. You run your hand along a column and feel the indent where a sculptor's chisel slipped. A tiny mistake, frozen forever. You glance up and catch sight of a lion eating a bishop tucked behind a saint's serene gaze. You smile. The building is serious, but it's not humorless. Even outside, in the quiet courtyard, figures continue. Angels perched on corners, snarling wolves at the roofline, and gargoyles, always watching, always dribbling. Here's something to sleep on. Some believe the grotesques on cathedrals represent the outside world. The wild, sinful, unpredictable realm outside the sacred walls. Inside, order, beauty, salvation. Outside, chaos, temptation, fanged monsters. In other words, these buildings were theology in 3D. Walk through the doors and you move from fear into grace. But even grace has a sense of humor. Tonight, as you drift off, let yourself walk slowly through that silent stone garden. Let the saints nod gently as you pass. Let the monsters leer from above. Let the carved angels whisper lullabies through chipped smiles. And if, in your dream, you catch a gargoyle sticking out its tongue at you, smile back. It's earned it. By now, you've probably realized something important. Cathedrals don't just build themselves, and they certainly don't get finished quickly. No, behind every sculpted angel, every ribbed vault, every stained glass sunrise, there is a small army of people working long, muddy, blistering hours. And they weren't just random volunteers with chisels and good intentions. They were part of something more organized, more sacred, and more binding than most modern marriages. Welcome to the world of the medieval labor guild, where jobs were inherited, contracts lasted a lifetime, and your work might outlive your grandchildren. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Most cathedral construction was driven by guilds, skilled associations of masons, carpenters, glaziers, blacksmiths, and sculptors. These weren't just job titles. They were vocations passed from master to apprentice over decades. Think of them as the LinkedIn of the 12th century, minus the networking brunches and unsolicited sales messages. If you were a young boy, usually around age 12, you might be apprenticed to a master mason. Your parents would sign an agreement, sometimes quite literally a lifetime contract, and you'd spend the next 7 to 10 years learning the craft. For room, board, and a whole lot of verbal abuse. You'd carry tools, mix mortar, sweep the site, and slowly, gradually, be allowed to actually touch stone. The idea was simple: watch, do, repeat. And if you survived long enough without dropping a keystone or accidentally carving your name into the bishop's face, you'd eventually graduate to journeyman, a worker who had finished training but wasn't yet a master. Why journeyman? Because you'd often journey to different towns to find work, learn new techniques, and prove yourself. Some journeymen walked across entire countries, leaving their marks, sometimes literally carved initials in cathedrals from Cologne to Canterbury. The cathedral world was like a massive group project, and journeymen were the ones doing the heavy lifting. But to become a master, now that was the real prize. You'd have to submit a masterpiece, an actual piece of stonework or architecture proving your skill. And it had to impress the guild. If they liked it, you'd get your own team, your own projects, and possibly a position as master of works, overseeing entire cathedrals. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe certain guilds, particularly among the Freemasons, guarded not just trade secrets, but spiritual or mystical knowledge. Symbols etched into stone, sacred geometry, coded tools. While modern Freemasonry is more fraternity than guild, there are theories, controversial of course, that medieval Masons had rituals, oaths, and initiations designed to preserve secret knowledge dating back to the Temple of Solomon. Was it true, or just a really well-branded myth? We may never know, but the symbols, compasses, squares, all-seeing eyes still haunt the corners of old stones. Back to the work site. Cathedral labor was brutally hierarchical. Masters gave orders, journeymen executed them, apprentices carried buckets, dodged insults, and tried not to get flattened by falling timber. But guilds offered protection, too. If you were part of the Masons Guild, you couldn't be underpaid, overworked, or replaced by some untrained hack. There were rules, standards, even health support. If you got injured, the guild might provide food or care until you recovered. Of course, guilds also loved rules. Want a taste? No member shall carve on Sunday. No master shall steal another's apprentice. No journeyman shall claim the work of a master. No apprentice shall strike a master, even if insulted. That last one says a lot. The cathedral was a rotating stage of specialists. The carpenters crafted the scaffolding and centering for the arches. The blacksmiths forged tools, nails, and iron reinforcement bars. The roofers worked with lead sheets, often melting them over open fires with no masks. The glaziers, already introduced, turned fire and sand into biblical rainbows. And the masons? They were the rock stars, literally shaping the bones of the building. And none of them worked in isolation. Every trade overlapped. A sculptor might need a blacksmith's custom chisel. A mason might rely on a carpenter's framework. There was tension, of course, arguments over delays, errors, or stolen ale, but mostly there was interdependence. You survived together, or not at all. Now here's a scholarly debate. How autonomous were these workers? Were they truly craftsmen, creative and empowered, or just skilled laborers following blueprints from on high? Some believe masters had significant freedom, especially in sculpture and decoration. Others argue they were tightly controlled by bishops, funding councils, and theological advisors. After all, this wasn't just a construction site. It was a religious battleground. Every statue had a meaning, every arch a purpose. You couldn't just carve a naked goblin playing a lute into the doorway, unless you were very sneaky. Still, creativity thrived. One famous anecdote tells of a mason who was ordered to sculpt a lion's head above the choir entrance. Instead, he carved his wife's dog, because, as he put it, it barked more ferociously. The head priest didn't notice for 20 years. By then it was tradition. Let's not forget the lifetime aspect of the cathedral work. Most cathedrals took decades, if not centuries, to complete. That meant your entire life could pass while building a single transept. Some apprentices started carving before they had beards and were buried before the nave was roofed. Whole families worked on the same cathedral, fathers passing tools to sons, who passed secrets to their nephews, who whispered advice to wide-eyed apprentices. Generational loyalty ran deep. If your grandfather shaped the first stone and your father hoisted the first arch, you better believe you'd want to see that spire kiss the sky. And yet, there was no guarantee of completion. Fires destroyed years of work. Wars halted funding, plagues decimated crews, and sometimes, just sometimes, the bishop ran out of money and the whole thing ground to a halt. Skeletons of unfinished cathedrals still dot Europe, testaments to ambition outrunning reality. But when things did go right, when a vault closed, a rose window gleamed, or a tower rang its first bell, celebration erupted. The guilds would host feasts, processions, and dances. Bread flowed, ale flowed faster, and the workers, sunburnt and scarred, would look up at their work and know this will be here long after I'm gone. That's the soul of cathedral labor. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about recognition. It was about permanence, about building something you'd never live to see finished, but would endure longer than your name. So tonight, as you lie still, think of the mason at the end of his day, his hands blistered, his tunic damp with sweat and dust. He leans against a column he carved 5 years ago. It's cool to the touch, solid, eternal. Above him, the spire rises, inch by inch. Beside him, an apprentice sketches patterns in chalk. Behind him, the stones whisper. Work is never finished, but sometimes that could last forever. You've met the masons, the sculptors, the glaziers, and the guilds. You've watched them grind stone into glory and chisel saints into every corner. But there's something missing from this grand cathedral story, something essential, something unglamorous, humble, and often overlooked. The tools? That's right. Tonight we dig into the quiet magic of medieval tech. The ropes, pulleys, mallets, cranes, and gadgets that made the impossible just barely doable. Because for all the divine ambition, for all the sacred geometry and prayers, none of it mattered if you didn't have the right gear to lift a 3-ton block of limestone 20 feet into the air without killing anyone. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Medieval builders didn't have access to complex machinery, but their tools were ingenious, efficient, and deeply refined. In fact, some of the basic devices used on Gothic cathedrals haven't changed in principle for over 800 years. The same physics that held Notre Dame together still powers modern cranes, winches, and levers. So let's talk about the MVP of the worksite, the tread wheel crane. Imagine a giant hamster wheel. Now imagine a grown man walking inside it like he's exercising, only instead of running for health, he's hoisting cathedral walls with every step. These cranes were often 30 feet tall and made entirely from timber. A wheel rotated on a wooden axle connected to a long rope that wound around a drum. As the worker walked, the rope would wind and unwind, lifting or lowering materials as needed. It wasn't just effective, it was borderline poetic. Human power, simple machines, sacred ambition, all spinning in concert, but they weren't lifting blindly. That brings us to plumb bobs, levels, and measuring rods. A plumb bob, a simple string with a weight on the end, was used to check verticality. Want to know if your wall is straight? Hang the bob. If it touches the line you drew, congratulations, your wall won't collapse in 2 weeks. You also had the mason square, the compass, and the chalk line. These were the essential tools of every craftsman. Medieval masons weren't eyeballing their angles. They measured, checked, rechecked. They trusted geometry more than they trusted the bishop's math. Your scholarly debate tonight: did medieval builders use scaled architectural drawings like we do today? The traditional belief says no. They used tracing floors, full-size diagrams laid out on stone slabs or wood panels, carved or drawn in chalk. Builders could walk across these blueprints, place templates, and physically model what they were going to build. Others suggest that some advanced plans were drafted to scale, lost to time, or held in secrecy by the master masons. The argument continues in hushed scholarly circles, usually over too much coffee and not enough daylight. Now here's your fringe gem. Some claim the tools themselves were symbolic, that the compass and square didn't just build cathedrals, they represented cosmic truths. In certain guild traditions, the tools were blessed before work began. The hammer was held aloft and prayed over. The square was kissed like a relic. Whether it was superstition, ritual, or something more mystical, the reverence was real. Back on the site, you'd see more timber tech than stone, scaffolds made from pine and oak, ladders lashed together with rawhide, hoists, windlasses, and capstans, all crafted from wood, rope, and muscle. Everything was temporary but crucial. A single cracked beam could bring a week's work crashing down. And yet timber was everywhere, hidden in the ribs of vaults, supporting the roof trusses, wrapped around towers to form spiral ramps. There's even evidence that some cathedrals had full wooden frameworks built inside the stone shell, not as decoration but as skeletons to absorb shifting stress and guide movement. Wood was light, flexible, and forgiving. Stone's quieter, more patient cousin. And let's not forget templates. These were wooden or metal guides, shaped to match the curve of a rib or the profile of a molding. A mason could lay the template over a stone and carve to fit. This was key to uniformity, especially when you had dozens of workers shaping hundreds of stones across multiple years. You didn't just trust your gut, you trusted the template. Now here's where things get cheeky. Not all tools were glamorous. One tool, affectionately known as the bum board, was simply a plank with a notch that let workers sit on vertical walls, legs dangling, while carving or laying stone. Think of it as the medieval version of a harness, but with 100% less safety. There's also the banker, a low wooden bench used for carving stone on the ground. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy table. But this is where the magic happened. The banker was where rough blocks became faces, flowers, gargoyles, saints. It was dusty, loud, and always a bit dangerous. Stone chips flew like angry bees. One journeyman once wrote, in Latin no less, that carving a statue's face was like trying to find a soul in a boulder. And you know what? He wasn't wrong. Now let's switch gears for some comic relief. Imagine a mason yelling down from a scaffold, "Send up the hammer." 5 seconds later, a hammer comes flying through the air, without warning, without care. It misses him by inches, embeds itself into a support beam, and becomes a permanent part of cathedral history. That beam? Still there. The hammer? A local legend. Another gem. A glazier drops a pane of finished glass. It shatters. He curses so loudly it echoes off the vaults. The bishop walks by, hears it, and says, "Ah, another prayer." The glazier is forgiven. The glass, sadly, is not. But accidents weren't the only challenge. Weather ruined tools constantly. Rain swelled timber, sun warped ropes. Frost froze pulleys in place. Work had to pause often. Not for holidays, but because the tech simply couldn't handle the elements. Yet still, the work continued. Why? Because every rope that lifted a stone was lifting a promise. Every chisel strike echoed across centuries. These tools, simple, handmade, mortal, were building something immortal. And sometimes tools became treasures, passed down from father to son, master to apprentice, not because they were the best tools, but because they carried the memory of 1,000 work days. Nicks in the handle, scratches on the edge, a handle worn smooth where calloused hands had gripped, day after day in service of something greater. Tonight, as you lie back and let your thoughts drift, picture yourself holding one of those tools. A wooden mallet, still warm from the sun, a chisel, sharp but humble, a rope stretched tight between ground and heaven. Feel the grain of the handle, hear the squeak of the wheel, smell the sawdust and the sweat, and know that in the right hands, even the simplest tool can change the world. The walls are up. The ribs are locked, the windows glow, the saints are grinning, the gargoyles are sneering, and somewhere below all of it, A mason leans back and mutters, "Now we go higher. Yes, now we go higher. You've built a church. Now you're building a cathedral, and that means towers, spires, bells that shake the sky, and floors that sway just slightly when the wind decides to test your faith. This is the chapter of vertical ambition and architectural anxiety. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Towers and spires were the final and most dangerous stage of cathedral construction. Why? Because the higher you build, the more wind you catch. The more weight you stack, the more pressure you dump on the foundations. And the more rope you need to hoist materials, the more your forearms cry out for retirement. And yet they did it. From Strasbourg to Salisbury, cathedrals didn't just rise, they reached. Gothic architects wanted to touch heaven, and they weren't going to let gravity bully them into moderation. The tallest spire of the medieval world, Ulm-Minster in Germany, soars over 530 feet. That's higher than most modern skyscrapers, and it was built without steel, computers, or OSHA. How? Let's talk bells first. Every cathedral needed them. Not one, not two, but dozens, each with a different tone, size, and job. Bells marked the hours, called the faithful, warned of fire, and celebrated feast days. In some towns, the bell tower was the town clock. If you heard it ring 13 times at midnight, either it was a solemn feast or someone was messing with the belfry ropes. Here's the trick. Bells are heavy, very heavy. The biggest ones could weigh several tons. Hauling them into the tower was a feat of logistics, prayer, and mild panic. Workers would use treadwheel cranes, pulley systems, and scaffolds strong enough to hold an elephant. The bell would be hoisted inch by inch, day by day, until it slid into place above a beam thick as a tree trunk. Then came the testing. One wrong strike, and your masterpiece might crack. And bells did crack, often. In fact, the famous bell of Rouen shattered during its first toll, sending a sound so thunderous it reportedly knocked over a ladder 2 streets away. Now, the bell tower wasn't just a vertical storage unit. It was a symbol, a beacon. In many towns, the cathedral tower was the tallest structure for miles, a kind of architectural mic-drush. People would look up from their fields, their bread ovens, their morning arguments, and see that spire slicing into the clouds like a divine needle. But getting there? That took bravery. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some cathedrals used helical scaffolding inside towers, wooden ramps coiling upward like a snail shell. These allowed workers to walk to the top while dragging tools, stones, or, let's be honest, each other. Some of these spiral pathways were temporary. Others were integrated into the tower structure. Scholars still debate which ones were intentional and which were happy accidents that got fancy names later. Now let's talk about spire design, aka, how do you build a rocket out of limestone without dying? Spire construction involved 3 main challenges: weight, the taller the spire, the more downward force. Builders compensated by thickening the base and tapering the shape like a pencil point. Wind is sneaky. It twists, it pushes, and it doesn't care about your prayer schedule. Builders used open work spires, delicate-looking, lattice-like structures that let wind pass through instead of smashing into solid surfaces. Flexibility. Believe it or not, stone bends, very slightly, especially when arranged in a tall, vertical structure. Good spires flex with the wind, bad ones crack. And yes, some did crack. One famous failure was the Beauvais Cathedral. They tried to outdo everyone with a 500-foot tower, but structural flaws and overambition led to partial collapse in 1573. Historians still argue if it was hubris or just poor planning. Probably both. Either way, it's a reminder that heaven has height limits. Now for your scholarly debate. Were towers spiritual or political? Some say they were built to praise God, reach heaven, and inspire awe. Others argue they were status symbols, giant flexes by bishops, kings, or rival cities. Oh, your cathedral has 1 bell tower. That's cute. Ours has 2, plus a flying buttress shaped like a lion eating a saxophone. Honestly, both are probably true. Medieval humans were just like us, capable of holiness and petty competition in the same breath. Here's where things get personal. You, the worker, have been on this project for decades. You helped carve the capitals, shape the arches, fill the windows with fire-colored glass. And now you're 200 feet in the air, standing on a wooden platform narrower than your dining table, fitting the final stones of the upper tower. The wind whistles, your boots slip, your fingers blister, and still you smile. Because this is the top. Above you, the sky. Below you, the whole town. Market stalls, homes, farmlands, the river threading through the valley like a silver ribbon. Somewhere down there, a boy rings a bell just to hear the echo bounce off your half-finished spire. And as you stand there, something occurs to you. You'll never see the cathedral finished. The spire may get taller, the roof may be leaded, the choir may finally stop complaining about the cold draft in the nave. But you'll be gone. A name carved in a ledger, a whisper in the stone. And still, you place the next brick, because this isn't about you. It never was. It's about the generations who will climb the tower and gasp, the bells that will toll for weddings, wars, and saints' feast days, the children who will press their faces to the windows and wonder how such a thing ever came to be. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavier, let yourself rise once more, float upward in your thoughts. Feel the tower sway gently beneath your feet. Let the wind sing around you like a choir of air. Listen for the bell that hasn't rung in centuries, calling out through memory. And when you look down, see the cathedral below you. Not finished, not perfect, but proud, just like you. By now you've seen the sweat and scaffolding, the ribbed vaults and bell towers, the sacred math and stone miracles, and maybe, just maybe, a question has started to form in your sleepy mind. One that pierces through all the wonder and holy ambition like a chisel to limestone. How did they pay for all of this? Seriously, who picked up the tab? Because building a cathedral wasn't just a labor of love. It was a financial black hole that could swallow entire economies. You're talking about hundreds of workers, rare materials, glass imported from other countries, timber from sacred forests, and tools that had to be replaced weekly. Multiply that over decades, sometimes centuries. That's a lot of zeros, especially in a time before spreadsheets, crowdfunding, or suspicious GoFundMe campaigns. So let's crack open the dusty medieval ledger and look at how these holy skyscrapers were funded. Spoiler alert, the methods were about as messy, creative, and morally gray as you might expect. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Cathedrals were primarily funded by a mix of church tithes, wealthy patronage, public donations, and yes, indulgences. You heard that right. The original pay-to-win system in history. The church in all its glory had power, land, and influence. But building a cathedral? That required more than spiritual clout. It required cash. Cold, clinking, medieval cash. The first place to tap was the faithful. Every townsperson was expected to tithe, a percentage of their earnings, usually about 10%, to the church. This tithe went to support priests maintain the church and, conveniently, help bankroll that ever-growing tower of holiness being built down the street. Refuse to pay? Risk eternal damnation. Or just some very aggressive sermons. But tithes weren't enough. Enter the wealthy patrons. Nobles, kings, merchants, and ambitious bishops who saw the cathedral not just as a house of God, but as a monument to their own legacy. You'll often find their names carved discreetly into walls, their faces hidden in stained glass corners, or their coats of arms tucked beneath the feet of angels. It's the medieval equivalent of having your name on a hospital wing. Some patrons gave out of genuine piety, others gave out of guilt. And some gave because they wanted a say in how the building looked. There's a recorded case of a baron who donated a fortune on the condition that one of the gargoyles resemble his brother-in-law. No one argued, they needed the money. Here's where it gets juicy and where your fringe tidbit comes in. Some of the most aggressive fundraising was done through the sale of indulgences. These were official documents blessed by the church that promised a reduction in time spent in purgatory in exchange for a donation. The bigger the donation, the faster your soul would slide into paradise. Needless to say, this system was abused. People paid enormous sums, hoping to shave decades off their post-death sentence. Entire campaigns were launched, monks sent on speaking tours, indulgence preachers shouting in the square, relics paraded through the streets with signs that read, "Touch the saint's tooth, save your grandmother." The money flowed, the cathedral rose, and yet even that wasn't enough. So what's next? Taxes. The bishop, in partnership with the local lord, might impose special levies on grain, beer, wool, or salt, all for the glory of the cathedral. In some towns, every sack of flour sold contributed a tiny coin to the rising spire. It became so normalized that people called it God's cut. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some peasants grumbled that their children were barefoot while the bishop commissioned a third rose window. Some merchants claimed their stalls were taxed twice, once for the cathedral and once for the cathedral's upkeep. There are reports of riots, petitions, even letters sent to Rome begging for relief. And yet, the money kept coming. Now here's your scholarly debate. Was the funding of cathedrals a form of economic oppression or spiritual investment? Some historians argue that cathedrals drain communities, locking them into poverty for generations. Others insist the opposite, that cathedral projects created jobs, boosted local economies, and gave people a sense of purpose and pride. And it's not just academics who argue. Town records show heated disputes between citizens and bishops. One famous town council refused to fund additional sculpture for the choir until the nave was finished, prompting a stonemason strike in a very tense Easter service. Of course, not all funds came from towns. Some came from pilgrims. Cathedrals that housed relics, bones of saints, fragments of the cross, vials of holy tears became pilgrimage destinations. And pilgrims, blessed their blisters, brought money. Inns, bakeries, candle shops, and souvenir stands all profited. And the cathedral? It charged admission. You want to see the saint's toe? That'll be 2 denarii and a prayer. Some cathedrals even use miracle marketing. Rumors would mysteriously spread that a certain relic had healed a blind man or revived a chicken. Suddenly pilgrims doubled, donations tripled. Coincidence? Probably not. Then there were the construction lotteries. Yes, lotteries. Some cathedrals raised funds by selling tickets. Winners got prizes like livestock, tools, or symbolic honors. Losers, well, they got to tell themselves they were helping the choir roof get patched. Yay. Let's not forget the sin fines. Committed adultery? Paid your penance, in coin, swore in the cathedral? That's a fine. Got drunk and fell asleep in the bishop's garden? That'll be a silver piece. Every bad decision became a small donation to the cause. Even the workers got involved. Masons and carpenters sometimes donated part of their wages toward completing the vision. Whether it was spiritual duty, peer pressure, or a very persuasive guild leader is unclear. But the idea of building, not just with hands, but with heart and wallet, was common. So tonight, as you imagine the candlelit cathedral rising inch by inch, remember this. Every stone had a cost. Every arch a price, and behind the elegance of every window was a ledger, scribbled in ink and sweat. Picture the treasurer hunched in a side chapel, counting coins by lantern light. Imagine the indulgent seller shouting over the crowd, waving a scroll that promises eternal peace. For the right donation. Hear the baker grumble as another flour tax bites into her profits. See the bishop smile as new fund arrived from a grateful widow. And yet, somehow, amid all the money and messiness, it worked. The cathedral rose, piece by piece, funded by saints and sinners, kings and carpenters, bakers, beggars, and people who just didn't want to spend eternity waiting in purgatory. Tonight, rest easy knowing that something beautiful can be built, even when motives are mixed, when methods are flawed, and when funding looks more like chaos than grace. Sometimes holiness comes with a receipt. At this point, the cathedral has become more than a structure. It's an entire lifetime in stone, a monument to persistence, a testimony carved through generations. But just when things seem to be going smoothly, just when the final tower is starting to peak, the choir vaults are echoing with song, and the windows are catching the morning sun like holy fire, something happens. Something always happens. Because this is where we talk about delays, and not the gentle, polite kind. I'm talking about medieval, soul-crushing, progress-halting, generation-deflating catastrophes. Welcome to the part of the story where you find out what really tests a cathedral builder's faith. Weather, wars, and wild unpredictability. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. Most cathedrals took between 100 and 300 years to complete. That's not a typo. That's not a poetic exaggeration. That's just how long it took. Whole dynasties came and went. Popes were born and died. Towns burned down and were rebuilt. And the cathedral? Still under construction, still wrapped in scaffolding, still surrounded by piles of stone, confused sheep, and architects nervously updating timelines. Why the delay? Oh, where to begin? Let's talk about weather. Rain? Bad. Wind? Worse. Snow? Don't even ask. A sudden storm could wash away weeks of foundation trenching. A lightning strike could obliterate a spire or set a timber roof on fire. And cold? Cold was the true killer. Mortar doesn't set properly below freezing. Stones crack. Ropes freeze stiff. Workers slip on icy scaffolds and end up part of the burial ledger instead of the construction roster. One recorded incident in Amiens notes that winter rains made the entire worksite sink 3 inches into the mud. The cathedral had to be partially re-leveled with shovels, gravel, and quiet cursing. Oh, and then there was the wind. At high elevations, wind wasn't just inconvenient, it was relentless, especially while working on towers or placing the final keystone into a delicate arch. There are stories of entire wooden cranes being torn from rooftops and dashed to pieces. One unlucky mason was reportedly blown clean off the south tower of Cologne. Legend says he was holding a trowel and didn't drop it, which feels either poetic or suspiciously embellished. And if the weather didn't get you? War would. Cathedrals were built in Europe, which means they were built in medieval Europe. You know, the land of endless feudal disputes, crusades, territorial grabs, and spontaneous royal grudges. Construction could halt for years due to siege, rebellion, or the simple fact that the king needed all the stoneworkers to build a new fortress instead. A cathedral might sit abandoned mid-nave because the bishop had to flee, or because the town was burned to the ground. And when the war ended, sometimes there was no money left, sometimes there were no workers left, and sometimes the cathedral simply wasn't anyone's priority anymore. One particularly tragic story is that of the Cathedral of Albi in France. Construction began with high hopes, and then the Albigensian Crusade happened. The building sat incomplete for decades, shadowed by war, politics, and religious violence. When work finally resumed, it was with a very different design. One meant more to intimidate than inspire. This leads us to our fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe that certain incomplete cathedrals were never meant to be finished in the traditional sense. Instead, the ongoing construction became part of their spiritual identity, an eternal act of devotion, always in progress. The idea being that humans should never presume to finish the house of God. Whether that's theological humility or bureaucratic justification is still debated, but it's an idea that's stuck. And speaking of debate, here's your scholarly hot topic. To what extent did architectural style shifts cause delays? Because while the builders were stacking stone, architectural tastes were changing. A cathedral begun in the Romanesque style might find itself halfway through pivoting to Gothic trends. Taller vaults, bigger windows, flying buttresses. This meant ripping out old plans, redesigning core structures, and, surprise, more delays. Imagine being a mason who spent 15 years carving Romanesque capitals, only to be told, actually we're going with pointed arches now, tear it down. You'd be furious, and you'd still show up the next day because you signed a guild contract and you haven't eaten anything but onion soup in 3 weeks. Let's not forget the worst delay maker of them all, plague. Ah, yes, the Black Death. When it hit in the mid-14th century, it didn't just kill millions, it decimated workforces. Entire guilds were wiped out. Masters who held the sacred knowledge of rib construction or tower alignment died overnight. Cathedrals were left frozen in time, half-finished domes, empty window frames, scaffolds abandoned like ghostly rib cages. Some towns lost half their population. Others were so desperate they recruited untrained labor just to keep building. The result? Flawed vaults, misaligned buttresses, bell towers that leaned a little more than they should. One town decided to brick up a half-finished nave and declare it done. The choir sang, Mass was held, and no one dared mention the gaping hole where the transept should have been. But through it all, weather, war, plague, politics, the dream lived on. The cathedral might pause, but it never died. In some cases, construction resumed decades later. Sons of sons picked up where their ancestors left off. Plans were redrawn, cranes were rebuilt. The scaffolding creaked again, and stone by stone the building rose once more. And through all the hardship, humor somehow survived. One mason reportedly carved a tiny umbrella above a saint's head. His quiet protest after 3 straight weeks of rain. Another left a small gargoyle holding a scroll that read, This wall will fall. It hasn't. Yet. Even the townspeople found ways to cope. During long construction pauses, they held dances in the unfinished naves. They planted vegetables in the trench for the apse. One town used the half-completed bell tower to store grain, and pigeons. The pigeons never left. So tonight, as you curl beneath your blanket and listen to the quiet of your own house, think of those builders. Think of the man who showed up after the rain, of the apprentice who filled his master's shoes after the plague, of the sculptor who waded through war, and the glazier who resumed work by candlelight 20 years after laying his last piece of glass. The cathedral didn't rise in a straight line. It rose through interruption, through loss, through hope, renewed again and again. Let that thought comfort you now, that what matters isn't how fast we build or how smooth the path is. What matters is that we keep coming back to the work, that we continue even when the skies darken and the future feels buried beneath dust. Even cathedrals needed time, so take your time. After generations of work, untold thousands of stones, buckets of mortar, years lost to war and weather, and more indulgences sold than anyone's comfortable admitting, the cathedral stands, not partially, not probably, but fully. It towers above the rooftops, bell towers slicing the sky, flying buttresses locked like stone wings in mid-flight, rose windows glowing like halos in colored glass. The scaffolding has finally come down. The pigeons have officially been evicted. The dust is swept. The floor is scrubbed. Every statue is in place. Every saint, every snarling gargoyle, even the weird monkey playing the lute someone snuck onto the southern arch. And now, it's time for the moment everyone's been waiting for. Consecration. But before the bishop waves the incense and the choir hits that first glorious note, there's one more step, one final alignment. Because in the medieval world, you don't just open a cathedral, you align it with the stars, with the saints, and with heaven itself. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Most cathedrals were aligned east to west, with the apse, the semicircular end that holds the altar, facing east. Why? Because the east is where the sun rises. It symbolized resurrection, light, Christ returning from the dead. Every morning as sunlight spilled through the choir windows, it was like the world was being reborn inside the stone. But this wasn't just a spiritual gesture. The alignment was mathematically deliberate. Builders would sometimes trace shadows with rods at sunrise on significant feast days, usually the feast of the patron saint. They'd mark where the sun struck the ground, then adjust the orientation of the walls accordingly, not an inch off, not a degree casual. It was sacred geometry in motion, and here's your fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe that certain cathedrals weren't just aligned with the sun, but with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, even the positions of specific stars. The cathedral at Chartres, for example, has long fascinated theorists for the way light streams through the stained glass on the summer solstice, landing precisely on a metal disc set into the floor. Coincidence? Maybe. Cosmic calendar? Maybe. Secret knowledge passed from the ancients? Oh, the conspiracy theories are glorious. And now, a scholarly debate to gently stir your brain before bed. Was this alignment purely symbolic, or did the builders believe they were tapping into something deeper, some divine resonance between heaven and earth? Some say it was liturgical pageantry, others argue it was mystical intent. That the cathedral was a tuning fork for the cosmos, built to vibrate in harmony with creation itself. Whatever the truth, the day of consecration arrives like a miracle. The town is ready, the people have gathered, not just the clergy and nobility, but peasants, pilgrims, beggars, bakers, all of them pressed shoulder to shoulder outside the great doors, eyes fixed on the stone marvel they helped fund, feed, and build. The bishop arrives in procession, incense swirls, bells toll, and the doors, those mighty carved oak slabs, swing open for the very first time. You're there. You walk in, and the moment hits like thunder. Light streams through the rose window, casting red and gold across the flagstones. Candles flicker like stars against the stone ribs above. The choir begins to sing, a low, trembling chant that seems to rise not just into the air, but into the bones of the building itself. The acoustics are perfect. Every note lingers like breath held in prayer, and now the rituals begin. The bishop walks through the cathedral in his full regalia. He anoints the altar with sacred oil, chrism, spreading it with slow circles like a painter blessing the stone. He sprinkles holy water along the walls, each splash a soft heartbeat echoing down the nave. He blesses the relics placed beneath the altar, bones of saints, fragments of holy cloth, little bits of sacred matter hidden in a hollow cavity like treasure buried in a tomb. Then comes the incense, sweet, sharp, rising in clouds that twirl like smoke signals toward heaven. The bishop swings the censer wide, and the air fills with scent, resin, spice, and something ancient. You breathe it in and feel it settle behind your eyes. Holy and strange. At one point, a group of barefoot children carries flowers down the central aisle. Their steps are slow, reverent. A baby starts crying, and no one minds. The choir keeps singing. The scent of beeswax candles mixes with incense and rose petals and dust, and for a moment, just a moment, it feels like the whole world is inside this one building. You can't help but look up. The vaults seem higher than you remember. The ribbed arches stretch like hands in prayer. You imagine the workers who built them, their fingerprints hidden in the mortar, their laughter still echoing faintly in the stone. You wonder if they're watching from somewhere, and then you see it. A single beam of light. It spills from the clerestory just above the choir and lands on the altar at the exact moment the bishop lifts the chalice. Not a second too early, not a second too late. Whether it's divine timing or very good architecture doesn't matter. The people gasp. Some kneel, some weep. Others just stare, stunned as light and stone perform their slow, silent miracle. The cathedral is no longer a construction site. It's consecrated. It's alive. From this day forward, it will host baptisms, weddings, funerals, coronations, festivals, protests, sermons, confessions, and choir rehearsals. It will survive plague and famine, fire and invasion, time and tourists. And it will always remember this moment. Now here's something soft to end on. After the service, the people linger. The bells ring again. Candles are left burning in the chapels. Children chase echoes across the transept. A monk leans against a column and hums to himself. Someone leaves a loaf of bread by the statue of Mary. Outside, the sky darkens. But inside, the cathedral glows. You've reached the final transition. You've walked through scaffolds and storms. You've chipped stone and mixed mortar. You've climbed towers and hung bells. And now, for the first time, you're simply a visitor, a pilgrim, a dreamer standing in the finished heart of something too vast to understand but too beautiful to deny. Tonight, as you lie in the quiet, imagine walking through that final door. Let the incense cling to your thoughts. Let the stained glass flicker behind your eyes. Let the chants settle into your heartbeat. The cathedral is finished, but its story is just beginning. The cathedral stands now, a testament to the ages. The scaffolding has been removed, the final prayers have been sung, and the bells toll in unison with the rhythm of life below. The sky above it seems bigger, wider, as if the cathedral has, in its quiet power, lifted the world into sharper focus. This is no longer just a building. It is a symbol of endurance, faith, and time itself. A structure built with the sweat of generations, the aspirations of many, and the belief that the world can be reshaped by human hands, working toward a divine purpose. But as the crowds disperse and the final echoes of incense and music fade into the evening air, you realize something important. This cathedral is not just a structure of stone and glass. It is alive. It breathes with history. It pulses with the lives of those who built it and those who will experience its beauty in the centuries to come. You begin to understand the full weight of what has been achieved, not just in the work done, but in the legacy left behind. Let's start with the legacy of craftsmanship. You know the workers, the masons, the carpenters, the glaziers, those who spent years, decades, and even their entire lives working in the shadow of the spires they would never see completed. Their names might never be known, their faces lost to time, but their hands shaped every corner of this place. Their fingerprints are still pressed into the stone. Their marks are etched into the very soul of this building. Every crack, every curve, every delicate detail tells the story of someone who, with calloused hands and steady hearts, believed that beauty and faith could be carved into the fabric of the world. The simplicity of their lives was forever intertwined with the grandeur of their work. And now you can't walk through the cathedral without sensing their presence, their quiet determination and their unseen struggles. Some historians have argued that these workers weren't just building a structure, they were building an identity for a people, for a community, for an entire nation. The cathedral became a physical embodiment of who they were and what they believed in. It was an expression of divine order, of society's place within that order, and the determination to leave something permanent for future generations. Then there's the legacy of the community. The cathedral wasn't just a place for the clergy or the wealthy elites. It was a symbol for everyone, for the townspeople, the farmers, the peasants, the children who ran beneath the unfinished arches. This cathedral was part of their identity. It connected them to something greater than themselves. The bells ringing at dawn, the incense filling the air during the Mass, the soaring vaults above, they all came to represent the community's shared aspirations, struggles, and hopes. Some people might have never stepped inside, but they too were part of its legacy. They worked in the fields and markets, and every coin they gave to the cathedral helped it rise higher. They ate their bread beneath the shadow of its walls, and their prayers, whispered on cold nights, were part of the sacred rhythm that moved the whole town closer to God. The cathedral became a meeting place for both the mundane and the sacred. It was where families were baptized, marriages were held, and funerals honored those who had passed. But it was also where disputes were settled, festivals were celebrated, and new generations were baptized into the promise of faith. And now generations have come and gone, and the legacy of the cathedral still endures. As you stand in the now completed cathedral, looking up at the soaring arches and glowing windows, you understand that what you see is not a final product, but an ongoing journey. The cathedral has witnessed centuries of human experience, the rise and fall of kings, the ebb and flow of power, the struggles of war, the triumphs of peace, and through it all, it has remained. It is timeless, but it is also alive in the hearts of those who experience it. Each person who steps inside, each moment that passes beneath its arches, contributes to its ever-expanding story. And just as the stones of the cathedral were raised one by one, so too will it continue to be built in the hearts of future generations. Some will stand before it in awe, others will work within its walls, but all will be a part of something greater than themselves. The cathedral will be passed down like a sacred heirloom, through time, through history, through the hands of those who care for it and those who breathe life into it. It will never be truly finished. Because a building of this magnitude doesn't simply exist as a static monument. It exists as part of an ongoing dialogue between the past, the present, and the future. And as you begin to leave the cathedral, you take one last look back. The golden light of the setting sun hits the rose window, casting a kaleidoscope of color across the stone floor. It is still here, still breathing, still waiting, still alive. In that final glance, you understand something profound. The cathedral is not just what it has been, but also what it will become. Every generation that passes will continue to shape it, to interpret it, to live within its legacy. The stones will wear and the walls will settle, but the spirit of the place, the faith, the community, the craftsmanship will never fade. Tonight, as you lie in your bed, let that thought rest in your mind, that you too are part of something larger than yourself. You are part of a continuum, a legacy that stretches back through time, reaching into the future. And just like the builders of the cathedral, you have your own role to play in the unfolding story of the world. So let your thoughts gently rise like the arches above the altar and feel the warmth of the legacy that surrounds you. The work is never truly finished, but that's the beauty of it. The story is always unfolding, and you, in your own quiet way, are part of it.